Welcome back, everyone, to the channel. We are continuing our review series of Dr. Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos. We are on to Chapter 12, Rule 12, guys. This is it. This has been a long time coming, but here we are. The last chapter in Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. Rule 12 is pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. I'll give my thoughts on this chapter very briefly before I get into the summary of this chapter. Rule 12 is, I think, a great way to end the chapter. I think it's a good optimistic. You're gonna see it's a good optimistic way to end the chapter. He ends not just the chapter, but he ends the whole book, I would say, on a light note, because this has been a pretty heavy book. I've said that a lot. I mean, I've said plenty of times that all these chapters I've been reviewing seems like, one after the other gets longer and longer. But it also could seem like every chapter I read got heavier and heavier. This is a heavy, sometimes dark book, not because I think Jordan's a dark person, just the subject matter that he's speaking on in this book and writing about is heavy and at times dark. So this chapter still is heavy at some points, but it ends on a high note. It ends on a high note, and I think it's a great way to sum up what's otherwise a hard book to read, an important book, and a valuable book. But I don't think you're going to find too many people who have read this book who are going to say, "Oh, that was a fun book. I had a great time." Not really. And I don't think that was Jordan's intention with this book either. So without further ado, I'm going to, like I've done with the other chapters, not going to read the whole chapter. I'm going to, pick and choose. I'm just kind of skip through his sections of the chapter here, give you guys a little brief summary of the chapter. So let's jump right into it. We're going to start off with his first section here to start the chapter. Dogs are okay too. I'm going to start this chapter by stating directly that I own a dog, an American Eskimo, one of the many variants of the basic Spitz type. They were known as German Spitzes until the First World War made it verboten to admit that anything good could come from Germany. American Eskimos are among the most beautiful of dogs, with a pointed, classic wolf face, upright ears, a long, thick coat, and a curly tail. They're also very intelligent. Our dog, whose name is Siko, which means ice in an Inuit language, according to my daughter, who named him, learns tricks very rapidly and can do so even now that he's old. I taught him a new stunt recently when he turned 13. He already knew how to shake a paw and how to balance a treat on his nose. I taught him to do both at the same time. However, it's not at all clear he enjoys it. We bought Siko for my daughter Michaela when she was about 10 years old. He was an unbearably cute pup. Small nose and ears, rounded face, big eyes, awkward movements. These features automatically elicit caretaking behavior from humans, male and female alike. This was certainly the case with Michaela, who was also occupied with the care of bearded dragons, geckos, ball pythons, chameleons, iguanas, and a 20-pound, 32-inch long Flemish giant rabbit named George, who dibbled on everything in the house and frequently escaped, to the great consternation of those who then spied his improbably large form in their tiny mid-city gardens. She had all these animals because she was allergic to the more typical pets, excepting Siko, who had the additional advantage of being hypoallergenic. Siko garnered 50 nicknames, we counted, which varied broadly in their emotional tone and reflected both the affection in which he was held and our occasional frustration with his beastly habits. Scumdog was probably my favorite, but I also held Rathound, Furball, and Suckdog in rather high esteem. The kids used Sneak and Squeak, sometimes with an appended O more frequently, but accompanied it with Snooky, Ugdog, and Snorphalocabus, horrible though it is to admit. Snorbs is Michaela's current moniker of choice. She uses it to greet him after a prolonged absence. For full effect, it must be uttered in a high-pitched and surprised voice. Siko also happens to have his own Instagram hashtag, #JudgmentalSiko. So there's the introduction to the chapter. Again, not going into all the headings here, but there's an introduction to the chapter, and I think it's a good light way to start the chapter. Now, as I'm going to show you guys when we get into the next his next section here, titled "Suffering and the Limitations of Being," you'll see how quickly takes a nosedive, I would say, and the chapter gets a little heavier. So we'll get into that, and I will summarize this next section for you guys and give you a little taste. So the next section here is called Suffering and the Limitations of Being. The idea that life is suffering is a tenet in one form or another of every major religious doctrine, as we've already discussed. Buddhists state it directly. Christians illustrate it with the cross. Jews commemorate the suffering endured over centuries. Such reasoning universally characterizes the great creeds because human beings are intrinsically fragile. We can be damaged, even broken, emotionally and physically, and we're all subject to the depredations of aging and loss. This is a dismal set of facts, and it's reasonable to wonder how we can expect to thrive and be happy, or even want to exist, sometimes, under such conditions. I was speaking recently with a client whose husband had been engaging in a successful battle with cancer for an agonizing period of 5 years. They both held up remarkably and courageously over this period. However, he fell prey to the tendency of that dread condition to metastasize, and in consequence had been given very little time to live. It's perhaps hardest to hear terrible news like this when you are still in the fragile post-recovery state that occurs after dealing successfully with previous bad news. Tragedy at such a time seems particularly unfair. It's the sort of thing that can make you distrust even hope itself. It's frequently sufficient to cause genuine trauma. My client and I discussed a number of issues, some philosophical and abstract, some more concrete. I shared with her some of the thoughts that I developed about the whys and wherefores of human vulnerability. So that's what this section, Suffering and Limitations of Being, is about. I don't really have to explain more about that. The section says it all. And Jordan's talked about that before in this book. That's been a recurring theme, a recurring subject that he's expounded upon in this book, about how we are fragile beings, we are limited, and we are vulnerable. And that plays a large role into the suffering that is intrinsic in life. Now, he goes on in the same section. I'm not going to read all this, of course, but he goes on to talk about his daughter, who had gone through a whole host of health complications when she was younger. Up until she was into her older teenage years, she was dealing with health problems, going through a lot of things like I think she went through juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. I hope I said that right. Juvenile rheumatoid arthritis for a long time, and she had other complications as well. And that's what Jordan starts talking about here. She started experiencing these symptoms when she was, 4 or 5 years old. She dealt with them since she was about a toddler all the way through her older teenage years. So that's what he talks about starting in this next point in this chapter here. So I'm going to skip ahead to the next section because I just want to summarize that for you guys. So we'll skip to the next section here called Disintegration and Pain. And I'm going to skip to the part here where Jordan talks about how, so when his daughter was going through this period of unimaginable pain and torture, and it was like years and years. She had to deal with it when she was in school as well. I mean, she was, her condition was affecting her bones. She was, her legs were breaking, and she was having a problem with her hips and all kinds of things. It was really awful they were going through. And of course, not just her, but as a family, because this affects everyone in the family, of course. So Jordan offers some advice at the end of this section here on what to do when you're faced with some situation like that. Not just, when a child of yours is dealing with a disease or an illness, which is awful, but any kind of tragedy like that. Jordan offers some good advice here. So he says here, during much of this period, we were overwhelmed. The demands of everyday life don't stop just because you've been laid low by a catastrophe. Everything that you always do still has to be done. So how do you manage? Well, here are some things I learned. Set aside some time to talk and to think about the illness or other crisis and how it should be managed every day. Do not talk or think about it otherwise. If you do not limit its effect, you will become exhausted and everything will spiral into the ground. This isn't helpful. Conserve your strength. You're in a war, not a battle, and a war is composed of many battles. You must stay functional through all of them. When worries associated with the crisis arise at other times, remind yourself that you will think them through during the scheduled period. This usually works. The parts of your brain that generate anxiety are more interested in the fact that there is a plan than in the details of the plan. Don't schedule your time to think in the evening or at night, then you won't be able to sleep. If you can't sleep, then everything will go rapidly downhill. Shift the unit of time you use to frame your life. When the sun is shining and times are good, the crops are bountiful, you can make your plans for the next month and the next year and the next 5 years. You can even dream a decade ahead. But you can't do that when your leg is clamped firmly in a crocodile's jaws. Quote unquote, sufficient unto the day are the evils thereof. That's Matthew 6:34. It's often interpreted as live in the present without a care for tomorrow. But that's not what it means. That injunction must be interpreted in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, of which it is an integral part. That sermon distills the 10 thou shalt nots of the commandments of Moses into a single perspective, thou shalt. Christ enjoins his followers to place faith in God's heavenly kingdom and the truth. That's a conscious decision to presume the primary goodness of being. That's an act of courage. Aim high, like Pinocchio's Geppetto. Wish upon a star and then act properly, in accordance with that aim. Once you're aligned with the heavens, you can concentrate on the day. But be careful. Put the things that you can control in order. Repair what is in disorder and make what is already good better. It's possible that you can manage if you're careful. People are very tough. People can survive through much pain and loss, but to persevere, they must see the good in being. If they lose that, they are truly lost. And I think that's good advice by Jordan on how to manage your time, how to deal with every, because like he says, when you're going through a tragedy in your life, some kind of crisis, whatever it is, life itself and the demands of other people don't come to a halt just because you're going through something rough in your life. And that's very true. And I think we've all experienced that at times in our life. Everything keeps happening. We continue to be bombarded even though we're going through a rough patch. So what Jordan says essentially is to cut your time frame back. So maybe you can't think about next year, so it's next month. Or if you can't think about next month, it's next week. Or it's just the next hour or the next minute, you know? And Jordan said this himself. I'm only paraphrasing what Jordan said in videos that he has online, as well, of course, from what I just read. I think it's really good advice to cut your time frame back. Focus on what's right in front of you. Like he says from that quote from the Bible, I believe, sufficient unto the day. Sufficient, he says, sufficient unto the day are the evils thereof. Sufficient unto the day. I think if there's nothing else you pull from this video of me reviewing this chapter, it's sufficient unto the day. And there's a Stoic idea in there as well. The Stoic talked about focusing on what's in your control, and as Marcus Aurelius talks about in his meditations several times, because let's remember that the meditations was his own private diary, his journal that he wrote to himself. And in the meditations, he reminded himself on more than one occasion to focus on what's right in front of him, not to think about what's going to be happening next month or what's going to be happening tomorrow. And a lot of those times when we worry about things that are going to be happening in the future, we don't even have any guarantee that those things are going to happen, right? A lot of times we're worrying about things that may or may not happen in the future. The things that seem like they're going to be so devastating to us and our livelihood in the future may not even happen at all. So we suffer, like Seneca said, we suffer more often in imagination than we do in reality. Now, I know this is not a video about Stoicism, but I think the ideas of the Stoics intertwine well both with this idea from the Bible and from what Jordan is saying. So it's good advice. Focus on what's in your control and focus on what is right in front of you. Focus on that first and then move on to the next thing. But take care of what's right in front of you, what's your immediate concern, what you have in control of first. And I think it's a good way to find peace, not just in the middle of tragedies, but just in our daily lives. I think it's very important. So we'll skip now, not really a skip, we're just going to flip the page here to the last section of this chapter. This is a short one, this is only 2 pages long, so I'm actually going to read this last part to finish the last chapter in this book, guys. So here's the last section. Dogs again, but finally cats. Dogs are like people. They are the friends and allies of human beings. They are social, hierarchical, and domesticated. They're happy at the bottom of the family pyramid. They pay for the attention they receive with loyalty, admiration, and love. Dogs are great. Cats, however, are their own creatures. They aren't social or hierarchical except in passing. They are only semi-domesticated. They don't do tricks. They're friendly on their own terms. Dogs have been tamed, but cats have made a decision. They appear willing to interact with people for some strange reasons of their own. To me, cats are a manifestation of nature, of being, in an almost pure form. Furthermore, they are a form of being that looks at human beings and approves. When you meet a cat on a street, many things can happen. If I see a cat at a distance, for example, the evil part of me wants to startle with loud sound, front teeth over bottom lip. That will make a nervous cat puff up its fur and stand sideways so it looks larger. Maybe I shouldn't laugh at cats, but it's hard to resist. The fact that they can be startled is one of the best things about them, along with the fact that they are instantly disgruntled and embarrassed by their overreaction. But when I have myself under proper control, I'll bend down and call the cat over so I can pet it. Sometimes it'll run away. Sometimes it'll ignore me completely because it's a cat. But sometimes the cat will come over to me, push its head against my waiting hand and be pleased about it. Sometimes it'll even roll over and arch its back against the dusty concrete, although cats positioned in that manner will often bite and claw even a friendly hand, which is true. Across the street on which I live is a cat named Ginger. Ginger's a Siamese, a beautiful cat, very calm and self-possessed. She's low in the big 5 personality trait of neuroticism, which is an index of anxiety, fear, and emotional pain. Ginger isn't at all bothered by dogs. Our dog Zico is her friend. Sometimes when you call her, sometimes of her own accord, Ginger will try to cross the street, tail held high with a little kink at the end. Then she'll roll on her back in front of Zico, who wags his tail happily as a consequence. Afterward, if she feels like it, she might come visit you for a half a minute. It's a nice break. It's a little extra light on a good day and a tiny respite on a bad day. If you pay careful attention even on a bad day, you may be fortunate enough to be confronted with small opportunities of just that sort. Maybe you'll see a little girl dancing on the street because she's all dressed up in a ballet costume. Maybe you'll have a particularly good cup of coffee in a cafe that cares about their customers. Maybe you can steal 10 or 20 minutes to do some little ridiculous thing that distracts you or reminds you that you can laugh at the absurdity of existence. Personally, I like to watch a Simpsons episode at 1.5 times regular speed. All the laughs in 2/3 the time. And maybe when you're going for a walk and your head is spinning, a cat will show up. And if you pay attention to it, then you'll get a reminder for just 15 seconds that the wonder of being might make up for the ineradicable suffering that accompanies it. Pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. P.S. Soon after I wrote this chapter, Michaela's surgeon told her that her artificial ankle, would have to be removed, and her ankle fused. Amputation waited down that road. She'd been in pain for 8 years since the replacement surgery, and her mobility remained significantly impaired, although both were much better than before. 4 days later, she happened upon a new physiotherapist. He was a large, powerful, attentive person. He'd specialized in ankle treatment in the UK, in London. He placed his hands around her ankle and compressed it for 40 seconds, while Michaela moved her foot back and forth. A mispositioned bone slipped back where it belonged. Her pain disappeared. She never cries in front of medical personnel, but she burst into tears. Her knee straightened up. Now she can walk long distances and traipse around in her bare feet. The calf muscle on her damaged leg is growing back. She has much more flexion in the artificial joint. This year, she got married and had a baby girl, Elizabeth, named after my wife's departed mother. Things are good. For now.